Good evening. Welcome to another session of the Comfort Verses in Context. Last week, we began our study to answer the question, what is the biblical tithe? We have set out in our study to see the occurrences of the terms for tithe as it occurs in scriptures, paying close attention to its dispensational context. Hence, a dispensational word study. Now, the term for tithe occurred 20 times in the Pentateuch, that is, from Genesis to Deuteronomy. And in those occurrences, we have asked the question and found answers to the following. Number 1, who commanded the tithe? Number 2, who performed the tithe? Number 3, what is the content of the tithe? And number 4, who are the tithes for? In those occurrences in the Pentateuch, we have seen two kinds of tithes so far. Number 1, the Patriarchal Tithes. These are the tithes that were given by Abram to Melchizedek, the priest of the Most High God, and it was characterized by the following. First, it was voluntary. No one commanded Abram to give the tithe, he just gave it. Also, it is not agricultural. This was because Abram tithed out of the spoils of war, not out of the produce of his field. Also, it was received by a different kind of priesthood. It was received by Melchizedek. And it was not a means by which Abram was counted as righteous. That, my friends, is the Patriarchal Tithe. We see the next as the tithe under the Mosaic Law. And this tithe is described as, number 1, it is required under the Mosaic Law. Since it is a requirement under the Mosaic Law, placed in par with burnt offerings and sacrifices, then it is a means by which one is counted righteous by the works of the law. Also, number 3, it is agricultural in nature. The tithes were the produce of the land and of livestock. Now, since it is agricultural, it was also done yearly or as per harvest, and there is such a thing such as a 3-year tithe for a different purpose than the normal tithe that serves for the food not only for the Levite, but also for the widow, the fatherless, and strangers in the land. Now, number 4, this tithe was received and for the use of Levites and the priests. Amazingly, we discovered that the children of Israel gave tithes to the Levites, and the Levites gave a tithe of the tithe for the high priest. Levites also perform tithes. And from what we have seen so far, the Patriarchal Tithe and the tithe under the Mosaic Law, those two kinds of tithing are quite different, albeit totally different from the modern tithe that is done in present-day churches. Now, this actually makes us think, does it not? It makes us think that the modern tithe is more of a human tradition than a biblical mandate. But let us study more. Now, we will be looking at the term tithe as it occurs in the writings and the prophets. Now, the terms for tithe occurs 14 times in the writings and the prophets, 14 times in the writings, which spans from Joshua to Song of Solomon. It occurs 3 times in the prophets, that ranges from Isaiah to Malachi. Now, all of the occurrences of the terms for tithe in the prophets are actually in the minor prophets. Now, a total of 17 times that the terms for tithe occur in the writings and the prophets. Now, let us begin with our study of the term for tithe in the writings and the prophets. Now, let us first look at the tithe in the writings. Now, as we begin our study with the occurrence of the term tithe, especially in the writings, it is remarkable that the first time it occurs would be in 2 Chronicles chapter 31, verses 5 to 12, under the King Hezekiah. Now, that means between Joshua to the time of Hezekiah in 2 Chronicles, this is the first mention of the term for tithes in the writings. The next mention would be also in Nehemiah, which is actually post-exilic. Now, we could think that tithing is something sporadic when it comes to the writings. Now, let us first look at 2 Chronicles chapter 31 so that we can see the first occurrence. Now, let us look at the context of the first occurrence in the writings so that it will give us an idea to see what is happening. Let's begin with 2 Chronicles chapter 31, verse number 2. And it says, "And Hezekiah appointed the courses of the priests and the Levites after their courses, every man according to his service, the priests and Levites for burnt offerings and for peace offerings, to minister and to give thanks and to praise in the gates of the tents of the Lord." Now, we see here that King Hezekiah appointed the courses of priests. This means to say that he restored the function and the ministry of the priests. Makes us wonder, what happened? Why did Hezekiah need to restore the courses of the priests? Now, before all this, we would read in 2 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 3, that Hezekiah opened the doors of the house of the Lord and repaired it. Now, this means to say that before Hezekiah, especially during the reign of King Ahaz, who was described in 2 Chronicles 28, verse 1, as did not, which is right in the sight of the Lord. During the time of King Ahaz, the temple fell into disrepair and was closed. Actually, under King Ahaz, a portion of the house of the Lord was taken and given to the king of Assyria. Remember Solomon's temple? It was made with gold and silver and brass and precious things. And Ahaz, to finance his war, took some of the house of the Lord, the temple, and gave it to the king of Assyria. Ahaz also took the vessels of the temple, cut into pieces the vessels of the temple, cut into pieces the temple, and shut down its doors to build altars for false gods in different corners of Jerusalem. You can read all that in 2 Chronicles 28, verse 4. Now, this is also how the services in the temple, as well as the priest courses, were halted. Now, when Hezekiah became king, he was described as he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that David, his father, had done. That's in 2 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 2. So, Hezekiah repaired the temple and opened the doors of the house of the Lord, which also entails that he must restore the ministry of the temple or the courses of the priests according to the law of Moses. That was what Hezekiah was doing in 2 Chronicles chapter 28 to chapter 30. Now, in 2 Chronicles chapter 31, we see him restoring the courses of the priests, and we read the next. 2 Chronicles 31, verses 3 to 4. And we would read these words. It says, "He appointed also the king's portion of his substance for the burnt offerings, to wit, for the morning and evening burnt offerings, and the burnt offerings for the Sabbaths, and for the new moons, and for the set feast, as it is written in the law of the Lord." I hope you got that. Verse 4. "Moreover, he commanded the people that dwelt in Jerusalem to give the portion of the priests and the Levites, that they might be encouraged in the law of the Lord." Now notice here the motivation of Hezekiah to restore the services of the temple with its sacrifices, Sabbaths, and feasts. That is, to obey the law of the Lord. Now, the portion given to the priests and the Levites are the people's tithes, as we see when we have looked at the tithe in the Pentateuch. Now, the motivation again is that they might be encouraged in the law of the Lord. Now, the tithe, as well as the sacrifices, the Sabbaths, and the feasts are all required by the Mosaic Law. And if you have tuned in last week, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 24 to 25, this is a requirement of the law, which is Israel's righteousness under the dispensation of the law. To obey the law for Israel is their righteousness. If you want to know more, you can look at Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 24 to 25. By this, we answer the question, who then commanded the tithe in 2 Chronicles 31? Now, we understand that the tithe given here is by the commandment of the Lord to Moses under the Mosaic Law. Because Hezekiah restored the courses of the priests, he reappointed the sacrifices, etc. Why? According to the word of the Lord, according to the law of the Lord. Now let's continue reading in verses 5 to 6. 2 Chronicles chapter 31, verses 5 to 6 says these words, and it says, "And as soon as the commandment came abroad, the children of Israel brought in abundance the first fruits of corn, wine, and oil, and honey, and of all the increase of the field. And the tithe of all things brought they in abundantly. And concerning the children of Israel and Judah that dwelt in the cities of Judah, they also brought in the tithe of oxen and sheep, and the tithe of holy things which were consecrated unto the Lord their God, and laid them by heaps." So we see here, who performed the tithe? Again, this would be the children of Israel as well as of Judah. And we ask the question, what is the content of the tithe? Again, as prescribed by the law, the tithe was of the all things would pertain to the increase of the field, specifically corn, wine, and oil, and honey. You see, agriculture. Also, the tithe was comprised of oxen and sheep, agricultural. Also, the tithe is of holy things. Now, we understand that as we remember the tithe in the Pentateuch, the holy things would pertain to the tithe of the tithe as we read also in Numbers. Again, who are the tithes for? Who received the tithes? We read that these tithes are unto the Lord their God. But please turn to 2 Chronicles 31 verse 12, and we would see a recipient of the tithe. It reads, "And brought in the offerings and the tithes and the dedicated things faithfully, over which Cononiah the Levite was ruler, and Shimei his brother was the next." So, all the offerings, the tithes, the dedicated things were received by the Levites, represented by Cononiah and his brother Shimei. The occurrence of the tithe in 2 Chronicles, if you would observe, is parallel to the occurrence of the tithe in the Mosaic Law. That is because it is still the tithe under the Mosaic Law. Now let's consider the next occurrence in the writings, which would be the three places in the book of Nehemiah. Let's first turn to Nehemiah chapter 10. That's Nehemiah chapter 10, verses 37 to 38. Now, this is what the Word of God says. "And that we should bring the first fruits of our dough and our offerings, and the fruit of all manner of trees, of wine and of oil, unto the priests to the chambers of the house of our God, and the tithe of our ground unto the Levites, that the same Levites might have the tithe in all the cities of our tillage. And the priest, the son of Aaron, shall be with the Levites when the Levites take tithes. And the Levites shall bring up the tithe of the tithes unto the house of our God, to the chambers, into the treasure house. So we see, who commanded the tithe? We read in the context of Nehemiah. Once again, Nehemiah is in the post-exile. He was reestablishing the services of the temple, much as Hezekiah did in his days, that we read in Nehemiah Chapter 10, verse 29, these words. It says, "They clave to their brethren, their nobles, and entered into a curse and into an oath, to walk in God's law, which was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe to do all the commandments of the Lord our God, and his judgments and his statutes." Basically, the reinstitution of the temple services again in the post-exile is a renewing of the Mosaic covenant, that is, to walk in God's law, which was given by Moses, with the purpose, if you notice in Nehemiah 10:29, the purpose is this: to do all the commandments of the Lord. Now, this tithe, again, is commanded by the Lord to Moses under the Mosaic Law. Again, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 24 to 25 is in effect. This is a requirement for Israel's righteousness as part of the Mosaic Law under the dispensation of the law. So, God commanded this tithe. Who performed it? We see in our passage that Nehemiah said, "we," which pertains to the rest of the people in Nehemiah 10:28, which ultimately pertains to Judah, who came back from the exile. Judah is the one who performed these tithes. This is still about Israel keeping the Mosaic law that they are under as per the dispensation of the law. Let's now see what is the content of the tithe. We see that the content of the tithe is the tithe of our ground. Again, it's agricultural produce. It also said, tithes in all the cities of our tillage. Tillage means you till the ground, and the produce of that ground, that's where they gave the tithes from. It's agricultural in nature. And also we see here the tithe of the tithe. So again, it's agricultural. Now, who are the tithes for? We see that the tithe of the ground and the tithe of the cities of our tillage goes unto the Levites. Bakit sa Levites na naman? It's because it's commanded by the Mosaic Law that the Levites have the tithes as their inheritance. The tithe of the tithe goes unto the house of God, to the chambers, and into the treasure houses. The tithe of the tithe is meant for the high priests and the priests, as we read in the book of Numbers. That's why it's stored in the temple storehouses. Now, these parameters once again show that they are identical to what was required under the Mosaic Law, because they are still the tithe under the Mosaic Law. Now, the same phenomenon is actually seen in Numbers chapter 12, verse 44. Let's turn to that. Numbers chapter 12, verse 44. And the Word of God says this: "And at the time were some appointed over the chambers for the treasures, for the offerings, for the first fruits, and for the tithes, to gather into them out of the fields." That's where they get the tithes. Fields of the cities, that the portions of the law for the priests and Levites, for Judah rejoiced for the priests and for the Levites that waited. Now, this is still part of the Mosaic Law commanded by the Lord through Moses for Israel. It is agricultural in nature, and it is for the priests and the Levites, just like the tithe in the Pentateuch under the Mosaic Law. Now let's look at Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 5. And it says this, "And he had prepared for him a great chamber, where aforetime they laid the meat offerings, the frankincense, and the vessels, and the tithes of the corn, of the new wine, and the oil, which was commanded to be given to the Levites, and the singers, and the porters, and the offerings of the priests." So, we see again, this is commanded by the Lord through Moses in the Mosaic Law, and it is commanded for Israel to perform. Once again, it is agricultural, being made of corn, new wine, and oil. It is given, if you notice in our passage, to the Levites, singers, porters, and the priests. This is what the Apostle Paul actually is referring in 1 Corinthians 9:13. If you memorize that verse, or if you could turn to that, Apostle Paul writes these words, "Do ye not know that they which minister about holy things live of the things of the temple, and they which wait at the altar are partakers with the altar?" Now that's how the ministers of the temple worship are sustained. So let's look at Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 12. Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 12, and it says, "Then brought all Judah the tithe of the corn, and the new wine, and the oil unto the treasuries." Now maybe you're saying treasuries, maybe there's treasures. Now treasuries are also words that mean storehouse. Okay, as part of the Mosaic Law, Judah performed the tithe, giving corn, new wine, and oil. Again, all of these are agricultural in nature. These are given unto the treasuries, which is actually for the use of the Levites and priests in the temple. Did you see the pattern now? All in all, in the writings that is from Joshua to Song of Solomon, specifically in 2 Chronicles and Nehemiah, the tithe is commanded by the Lord as part of the Mosaic Law given to Moses. It's commanded to Israel. It's a requirement for righteousness, and it is agricultural for nature, in nature, and it is given to the Levites and the priests. The same tithe in the Mosaic Law. Again, the question begs to be asked, how much of the biblical occurrences of the tithes look like our modern tithing? Are we commanded in the dispensation of grace to give tithes by our Apostle Paul? Do we give tithes that are agricultural in nature? Do we even have a priesthood that receives the tithes and are used solely by them? Those are things to think about. But let's continue our study. Let's look at the tithe in the prophets. Now, the term for tithe in the prophets occurs only 3 times, all of which are in the minor prophets, and actually there are only 2 prophets that dealt with the tithe. That is the prophets Amos and Malachi. We see the first. Let's look at Amos chapter 4, verse number 4. Amos chapter 4, verse 4 says these words, "Come to Bethel and transgress. At Gilgal, multiply transgression, and bring your sacrifices every morning and your tithes after 3 years." Now, before we look in that passage, we read Amos as a prophet to Israel, to the northern kingdom, during the time of Uzziah, king of Judah, and Jeroboam, the son of Joash, the king of Israel, in Amos chapter 1, verse 1. Now, the whole treatment of the tithe in Amos 4 is an indictment of Israel's sin and impending judgment because they brought their sacrifices and their 3-year tithe to the wrong place. Did you notice where Amos said, bring your tithe to, he said, come to where? Bethel, and transgress. At Gilgal, multiply transgression. Why? Because the truth is, it was the wrong place to bring their burnt offerings and their tithes. Instead of bringing their tithes to Jerusalem, which is part of the southern kingdom of Judah, because also of Israel's apostasy, they set a new worship place even during the time of the northern kingdom's first king, which is Jeroboam as well, who is Jeroboam the son of Nebat. Now from here, we see that tithing is according to the Mosaic Law, and it has to be obeyed to the letter. The tithe may be right, but wrong place? Wrong. Wrong pa rin. As it is commanded by God to Israel through Moses, its content and its recipients must be followed to the letter. Now this shows us that deviation for any reason, especially deviation for the sake of convenience, is not acceptable under Mosaic law. Therefore, a tithe that does not follow the regulations of the Mosaic law is unacceptable and is a sin worthy of judgment under the curses of the Mosaic law. That's something to think about. Wrong recipients of the tithe, wrong content of the tithe, wrong tithe. The tithe must be followed to the letter under the Mosaic law, or else it's the wrong kind of tithe. Now this brings us to the next occurrence in the prophets, which is Malachi Chapter 3, verses 8 to 10. Now this is actually, sadly, this is one verse that is very familiar. This is very familiar when it comes to many people. Sadly, this is the only verse they know about tithing. But let us consider this occurrence in Malachi chapter 3, verse 8 to 10. And it says, "Will a man rob God? Yet ye have robbed me. But ye say, wherein have we robbed thee? In tithes and offerings. Ye are cursed with a curse, for ye have robbed me, even this whole nation. Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house, and to prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven, and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it." Now that's a favorite of many, especially of prosperity gospel preachers and teachers, and sadly some evangelicals, because they claim the promise that God will open the windows of heaven if you give your tithe. But let's explore. Let's study our passage. Now, again, this is one of the most popular passage about tithing, and sadly this is the only passage of tithing that many know. Now, Malachi is a prophet to Israel according to Malachi chapter 1, verse 1. Like Amos, Malachi was indicting Israel for sin, one of which is, in our passage, would be robbing God by not bringing their tithes and their offerings. Now again, we see the tithe and the offering. Again, the tithe and offering here are not what you usually hear in the church, like we give our tithes and offering. The offering here pertains to burnt sacrifices and the sword, and they are placed at par with one another. Now, this indictment is brought about by an understanding that it is God who commanded the tithe to the people of Israel according to the Mosaic law. And inasmuch as the total obedience of the Mosaic law is for Israel's righteousness, we can also read in Deuteronomy 28, verse 15. Let's turn to that. Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 15. these words. Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 15 would say these words. Okay, it says in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse number 15, it says, "But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee." Now, I hope you heard that right. Now, there are curses for disobedience of the Mosaic Law. It is considered a disobedience of the law if all of the law would not be done. Tithing, my friends, is part of the law, and it is commanded by the Lord to Israel. I hope that's very clear by now. Hence, Malachi declared the covenant curses under the Mosaic Law for Israel who have neglected their tithes and offerings. You can read more of these covenant curses in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 16 to 45. That's a lot of curses. But let's also read Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 2. Because it says, Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 2 says this, "And all these blessings shall come on thee and overtake thee if," there's an if thou shalt hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God. Now this time, Israel, if she would obey all. That's the thing. You obey all the law that is commanded by Moses, which includes tithing. There will be blessings based on their total obedience to the law. That's Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 2. Now, these blessings can be found in Deuteronomy 28, verses 2 to 13. The blessings, if you want to read it, would include the following. Verse 5 says, "Blessed shall be thy basket and thy store." It's a promise of abundance. Verse 8, "The Lord shall command the blessing upon thee in thy storehouses, and in all that thou settest thy hand unto. And he shall bless thee in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee." Blessing of abundance. Verses 11 to 12 says this, "And the Lord shall make thee plenteous in goods, in the fruit of thy body, and in the fruit of thy cattle, and in the fruit of thy ground, in the land which the Lord sware unto thy fathers to give thee. The Lord shall open unto thee his good treasure, the heaven, to give the rain unto thy land in his season, and to bless all the work of thine hand. And thou shalt lend unto many nations, and thou shalt not borrow." If those covenant blessings sound familiar, it is because that is what Malachi evoked for Israel's obedience, which are the covenant blessings for obeying the law totally. Again, as with Amos, the tithe must be followed to the letter. Therefore, as commanded by God to Israel, it must be agricultural in nature, and it must be given to Levites and priests. For this reason, Malachi instructs that the tithe be brought into the storehouses, which actually is in the temple, for the purpose of being that there may be meat in mine house. Now, the phrase meat in mine house pertains to the temple and the food for Levites and priests. To obey this bring blessings, and to disobey this would bring curses. Now, here are important questions. Number one, are we Israel, that we are under the Mosaic Law and thus under the covenant blessings and curses? That's something to think about. Are we Israel? Is the tithe commanded to us? That the covenants of the promises of blessings and curses pertain to us as well? Now here's what the Apostle Paul writes. Let's turn to Romans chapter 6, verse 14. Romans chapter 6, verse 14 says this. Okay, Romans chapter 6, verse 14, it says this, "For sin shall not have dominion over you, for ye are not under the law, but under grace." Right there and then, Apostle Paul makes it clear that we are not under the dispensation of law for Israel, but we are under the dispensation of grace for both Jew and Gentile, which are made part of the body of Christ. If we are under the law, then we are debtors to the whole law. I want you to turn to Galatians chapter 5, verse 3, because Apostle Paul argued there, like in circumcision, that if, it says there, Galatians chapter 5, verse 3, it says, "For I testify again to every man that is circumcised, that he is a debtor to the whole law." Remember, circumcision is part of the law. If you obey one part of the law, you are a debtor to do the whole law. And now that's scary, because if we are a debtor to the whole law, let's look at Galatians chapter 5, verse 4. It says, "Christ is become of no effect unto you. Whosoever of you are justified by the law, ye are fallen from grace." That's a scary thought. If we think we can get covenant blessings from the law, we are a debtor to the whole law. And in doing so, Christ is become of no effect unto us. We have to answer the question in our dispensation: how are we justified in this dispensation of grace? Now let's read Galatians chapter 2, verse 16. We're already in the book of Galatians. Galatians chapter 2, verse 16, it says, "Knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law." I think that's very clear. A man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ. Even we have believed in Jesus Christ, that we might be justified by the faith of Christ, and not by the works of the law. For by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. Let me be perfectly clear. We are not justified by the works of the law. We are justified by the faith of Jesus Christ, who died for our sins, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day for our justification. We are saved not by doing the works of the law, but by trusting the finished work of Jesus Christ as sufficient for eternal salvation and justification. To keep one part of the law for us and say it's for our blessing and cursing is to declare Christ is of no effect to us. But here's another problem. If we are to keep the law, we have to keep the whole law. But how can we keep the whole law when we cannot even do sacrifices now because there's no temple present? There is no Levitical priesthood to receive our actual tithes or offerings. And much worse, we are Gentiles who are, according to Ephesians 2:12, aliens from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers from the covenants of promise. Much more, we do not keep the whole law. We do not keep the law actually when we give the modern tithe. Is the church building the temple where we are supposed to bring the tithe? I don't think so. Are pastors priests of the tribe of Levi and of the line of Aaron? Last time I checked, I'm a Filipino, not an Israelite, not of the tribe of Levi, not of the order of Aaron. Are the tithes that we give agricultural? I don't think so. That makes us actually lawbreakers, not following the law to the letter. And in giving and demanding the modern tithe, we become lawbreakers because the biblical tithe is far from the modern tithe. And we expect to be blessed. It's something to think about. Do you see a problem there? Now, we will end our study tonight right here. So far, we have seen that the tithe in the writings and the prophets are under the Mosaic Law. It is given by the Lord to Israel, and therefore is a requirement for their righteousness, and evokes covenant blessings for obedience and covenant curses for disobedience. It is agricultural in nature, and it is brought into the temple for the Levites and priests. It is so different from the modern tithe. Next week, we're going to look at the occurrence of the terms for tithe in the New Testament. And we will also answer what is the way in which we, in the dispensation of grace, are supposed to give. So thank you very much for listening. We do hope to see you in our future broadcasts. On Monday, Lord willing, we will release a new video of the Family Equipping Ministries. And on Thursday at 8 o'clock, we will be having another session of the Ephesians Bible Study, and hope to see you again next week in another session of the Comfort Verses in Context. So thank you very much for listening. Do have a nice day, and the Lord bless you.